Welcome to Age Hackers, powered by Gladden Longevity with Dr. Jeffrey Gladden, where our passion is to help you live young for a lifetime. On this show, we want to help you optimize your longevity, health, and human performance with impactful and actionable information by answering three questions. How good can we be? How do we make 100 the new 30? And how do we live well beyond 120? I'm Steve Ryder, and Dr. Gladden, we just wrapped up with Dr. Erik Korem, who came out of a long background working with major college football teams, NFL teams, other sports, professional sports entities. And he now has a company called AIM7. And we talk about it right at the very end. But this was a great conversation where he was basically telling you these are some of the best questions he's ever been asked on any podcast, because you were understanding the sports physiology and, you know, all of that kind of stuff when it comes to high impact athletes that you were pinging him and getting him to talk about some really cool stuff.
Well, yeah, it's a really fascinating conversation. He's really done a beautiful job of deconstructing performance, right? And it's really, really cool because he's all about helping people create adaptive capacity, right? Which is the ability to manage stress and actually thrive in stressful situations, quote unquote, stressful situations. He's got a 5-point way to go about that. He talks about his work with athletes and different kinds of training regimens, all the stuff they learned from all the monitoring, this super sophisticated monitoring they were doing on these football teams and things. I love this conversation. I think the audience is going to love it.
And for those that are interested in AIM7, the app, if you go to aim7.com and you sign up there, you'll get $1. You'll get your first month for just $1. And the stuff that he has coming down the pike, he told us about it afterwards, especially after the new year. There's some really cool features that are coming, and I'm giving this a try, and I'm excited about what it can do for my exercise.
It's a contextual AI that they've developed for coaching, which is, it's more than just personalized AI. It's contextual. Like, where are you in the world? Where did you sleep? Where did you travel to? What do you, so it's creating another level of assistance, if you will. It's helping you along your way. Super cool stuff. Welcome, everybody, to this edition of the Age Hackers podcast, powered by Gladden Longevity. I'm your host, Dr. Jeffrey Gladden, and I'm here with Steve Ryder. Steve, good to have you back again today. How you doing?
Man, it's good to see you. I'm doing well. Getting ready to go to Vancouver Island to go salmon fishing this weekend.
Oh, okay. Well, that sounds fun. Yeah, big fun. I'm down here in Puerto Rico dodging tropical storms at the moment. So,
oh, my goodness.
But we should get some surf later this week, so I'm excited about that. We have with us today Dr. Erik Korem, who is a very interesting guy, PhD, has done some interesting work in athletics, but has some really, I think, interesting takes on life that we're interested to explore with him. So, Erik, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for having me. It's a pleasure to be on the show, and I'm excited to dig in.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us a little bit about your background. You've got this PhD basically in applied, you call yourself an applied performance scientist, and a doctorate in exercise science with a research emphasis on sleep and stress resilience, which is a really kind of beautiful combination. But tell us a little bit, how'd you get into all that? What took you down that path?
Yeah, so I grew up in Dallas, Texas. I was a football player at Texas A&M, and I thought I wanted to be a surgeon, an orthopedic surgeon. And this is the late 90s, and we had a physiology lab attached to our weight room. Okay. And so this was like some of the early days of actually some of the like Gatorade studies on their RTD drinks was going on there. And it was a really it was a great lab. It's called the Huffines Institute. And I went to our head strength coach. I'm like, what's going on here? And he's like, there's a science to training athletes. And so I was a walk-on. And so as a walk-on, you're always looking for an advantage. And so I bugged him to death. I switched my major to applied exercise phys, and it was over with. So what really changed my outlook on this whole thing, though, is I went to the University of Arkansas to get a master's degree in physiology, and I was working as a graduate assistant training athletes at the University of Arkansas. And one day this coach walks in. He's like, hey, do you want to work with these athletes? And they were Veronica Campbell-Brown, who's an 8-time Olympic medalist, Tyson Gay, Wallace Spearman, Omar Brown. It was the golden age of sprints.
Yeah.
So for the next 14 years, I ended up traveling the world, more specifically with Veronica and her husband Omar, who was also a world-class sprinter. And I got to see how the rest of the world was training and developing athletes. And in the U.S., we were really behind.
Really?
And oh yeah. And
so tell us that. What were the big gaps that you saw?
Yeah, well, if I think our pride as an American, my pride, like, oh, we should be the best. Well, the thing that sets us back is that we have the best genetic pool in the entire world for athletes. And so, like, if you go to a place like Australia,
is that a function of the fact that we're sort of a mixing pot for a lot of different genetic backgrounds? Is that what you're referring to? Or
yes, absolutely. So there's certain countries where certain people of certain statures and heights and anthropometrics are set up differently for success in different sports.
Sure.
Like Kenya long distance runners.
Yeah, and that's a morphological situation. That's also, there's a whole lot of factors. And then there's also a training culture for the Kenyans. If you look at Western Africa, you can almost trace all the genealogy of the 100-meter record holders all back to Western Africa.
Yeah, Atkins region.
Yeah, so I mean,
prevalence of the sprinter gene on the planet. I think it's an 80% of the people there, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
But and then in the U.S., a lot of people, then you start blending all these different amazing, wonderful people, and and then we have the sporting culture also helps, right? But like, let's take a country like Australia, for instance. In the late 70s, they were 56th in the world in medal count. Massive continent, small population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, they were like, enough's enough. We're tired of losing and getting beaten up by everybody. So 1980s, they developed the Australian Institute of Sport, which brought the best in technology, physiology, biomechanics, psychology, all under one roof. And by the time the 2000 Olympic Games were held in Sydney, they were number 3 in the world in medals. Now, did their population change? No. Their preparation, their athlete selection, and some of the most advanced technologies in the world for athlete wearables came out of Canberra, out of that initiative.
Really?
So I'm seeing this play out on the global stage, and I'm like, I want to bring this sports science to the U.S. So that was my mission. And in 2010, I had the opportunity to do that. I was at Florida State University working with the new head football coach, Jimbo Fisher. And after the first season, he promoted me to director of football operations. So I'm like the GM of the team. And I'm like, I'll do it if you name me director of sports science. Well, that job didn't exist. So he's like, yeah, call yourself whatever you want. So I went to Australia as part of an information exchange with an Aussie Rules football club. And Australian Rules football there is huge. It's $1 billion TV contracts, 100,000 seat stadiums. And I was essentially with the OG high performance director from Australian Rules football, John Quinn, and Kevin Sheedy, who is like the Don Shula of coaches.
Okay.
And for a month, I am with this team. And I'm helping them on a specific problem. And I'm like, hey, look, while I'm here, what I want to learn about is sports science, the application of that in the context of what's called high performance. It's actually a structure, a system. And I want to learn about athlete tracking technologies because they were tracking athletes in game using GPS satellites, accelerometers, gyroscopes, magnetometers. It was amazing. So I come back and I bring this technology back with me. And Coach Fisher's like, yes, I will. Nobody had ever quantified the game of football. So we were the first ones to ever track somebody in games and in practice. And we had millions of data points coming off these devices. I ended up having to hire a former NASA propulsion engineer to help me reorganize the data. I mean, it's crazy.
Tell us a little bit about the data, because everybody's familiar with wearables these days, right? Everybody's got an Oura Ring or a Whoop or an Apple Watch or a Garmin or something, right? And we're all kind of getting the same basic information off those, maybe 5 or 6, maybe 7 variables. But what you're talking about is on another level here. You're talking about tracking people in motion, gyroscopically in motion, speed, acceleration, deceleration, forces, all these kinds of things. So what can you fill us in on kind of the range of what you were actually able to measure with these people?
It's in sports science, you could bucket data into two buckets: internal and external training load. External training load is what you did. So, for instance, how fast you ran, how far you ran, how many accelerations within certain bandwidths, decelerations. You can get.
Did it capture external things like how hard you got hit or how hard you hit the ground?
Well, you could measure that with what's called IMAs, inertial movement analysis, but you had to be kind of careful with that because nobody really. I mean, you could put an accelerometer in a helmet and know, but it was in the cervical spine, like roughly is the placement of it.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time, we weren't measuring that. We wanted to know what they were doing on the field. And then we had heart rate monitors on them to understand, at least at the beginning, like what are the actual bioenergetic demands of football?
Okay. This is the internal monitoring now?
That's part of it.
Okay.
Later on, we got way more advanced, and I can talk about that. But we learned a couple things. I would say, first of all, we learned that we were playing, like if you look at what the requirements of a football game versus what we were doing during practice during the week, we had a very talented coaching staff, an elite roster, but we were often injured. In that 2011 season, the year we tracked, we underperformed. And we were practicing like 5 games during the week before we got to Saturday. Guys were just exhausted. And then although every single position had unique demands, so for instance, a receiver that also played all 4 special teams may run 7,000 to 8,000 yards in a game, of which 1,000 to 1,200 could be high-speed distances. Where an offensive lineman may only sprint 50 yards in an entire game, which is from the sideline to the field. Yeah. But they were all training the same in the offseason. Now, does that make any sense?
Not exactly right. Yeah.
No, there'd been zero progression in how we developed athletes from junior high to the NFL. So to Coach Fisher's credit, he let us change the way that we practice, like manipulated some of that. Mostly it was like, let's manage certain players. We had a very sophisticated system for that. And then we changed the way that we trained. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, so it sounds like the training volume was too high is what I'm hearing. If the players were exhausted all the time and you're playing 5 scrimmages a week or something before the game, is that kind of what was happening? Or
it wasn't. It's a man. This is a really nuanced question. The only way you get really good at your sport is through high quality repetition, and you have to scale that. And from a pedagogical standpoint, from not applying pressure from speed and time constraints and other things, and then over time, high speed, high pressure, et cetera. The athlete that can get the most quality repetitions and learn the fastest is going to improve their skill the quickest. So volume in and of itself is not the problem. It's how fast you get to the peak volume. So you could look at it acute to chronic workloads. Tim Gabbett did a lot of research on this. So it was how quickly we were going from an off season and ramping up into a preseason where you would almost predictably, even now in NFL training camps, by day 10 is when you start seeing all the AC. It's so predictable. It is the same thing in college football and high school football and the NFL, unless you do something about it. And then during the week, it's understanding if we have to perform at our best on Saturday, there's a balance, or there's something called preparedness and something called readiness. Readiness is biologically, are you ready to play? Is your physiology able to produce the output? Preparedness is your skill. There's a technical, tactical components. When you see a team lay an egg, it's typically because their preparedness was there, but their readiness was not. But when preparedness and readiness meet, that's when you have elite performance or predictable, consistent performance.
And let me go back just a second to the training camps and people tearing their ACLs at day 10, and this whole idea of ramping up quickly to, repetitions under high pressure, high stress. What's the problem there? What are they doing wrong that people are tearing their ACLs? Are they trying to progress people too quickly, or they're not giving them enough rest, or what's actually happening?
Well, training camps are time constrained to 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
They go from a summer off season where they can only train 8 hours a week. I think now they can do 9 or 10 to 20 hours. So you have a twofold increase.
Yeah.
That's stupid. The literature is very clear on how far you can push the limit until you can predictably expect injury.
Wow.
Right.
So it was like, are we going to pay now or are we going to pay later? And if you're smart and you build slowly, by the end of training camp, you're doing more repetitions than your opponents with less cost.
But you have to build slowly to get to that. You can't get too eager about it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, 99.9% of coaches in America are too impatient. And I was on Nike's Performance Council. I worked with football there. I coached I helped some of the best high school programs in the country. The ones that put this into place, we had certain protocols. I would get stories back from these coaches like, we dropped our injury rate 50% and won a state championship this year.
Wow.
At that year that we put this into place at the Florida State, we had an 88% reduction in injury. We went from 9 wins to 12. We won the ACC championship in the Orange Bowl. After that season, the NFL flies in, and that opened a multi-billion-dollar market for sports wearables and data. So if you ever watch an NFL game and you see players running down the field and like, oh, they're running 21 miles an hour, that all started in Florida State. This is before Apple Watch. Fitbit wasn't much of a thing. So we can talk about wearables. But what the lesson that was learned in the very beginning, though, was this is funny. After 1 week, the head coach comes to me and he's like, hey, what are we going to do with this? I have all this data. I'm like, Coach, I don't know. And that didn't sit well.
Especially as director of science.
Yeah. And I mean, he just got one of the premier college jobs. It's his first head coaching job. And here he is making decisions with technology. So first season, he's like, just shut up and record. Very wise move. Then he had to make the decision, am I going to let these people change these? And to his credit, he did, and he reaped the benefits.
So I'm curious what you actually saw and what you actually changed. What did you do? And I understand that different people are playing different positions, so it probably is somewhat specific to the individual and their role. But can you give us some insight as to what you saw, what you changed, things like that?
Well, I mean, for instance, historically, football has been trained, and people think of football as a lactic game. So there's 3 energy systems: the alactic, the lactic, and the oxidative energy systems. And I was taught incorrectly in undergrad physiology that it was sequential activation, and we all know now that it's just a hodgepodge, but different systems can be more activated at one time, but they're all working in concert. But forever, it's like, oh, you run gassers, 300-yard shuttles, lactic power. The game of football is an aerobic alactic capacity game. What does that mean? It means that you're talking 5 to 7 second intervals with 45-second rest in between. So you need to develop a high threshold for alactic output and the ability to regenerate phosphocreatine quickly enough so you can continually repeat those efforts. And the aerobic system is critically important because it makes you more energy efficient. So the lactic energy system, we basically polarized our training, and our athletes were way fitter than everybody else. It wasn't even close.
So when you say you polarized it in what direction? More towards aerobic training?
Both. No. We developed the high end.
Yep.
So we did periods. We could spend a whole 2 hours on this, but we had blocks of time where it was like true power speed training, like we would do in track, maximal outputs.
So running sprints, essentially. Is that what you're saying?
Sprints, jumps, throws, heavy weights. Because people don't realize when you lift weights, you're training the bioenergy systems. When you practice, you train the bioenergy systems.
That's right.
And so it all works in concert. So we'd have periods where we're trying to increase the ceiling, and then we would polarize that with like extensive tempo runs to increase aerobic capacity. And then as we got closer to season, then we started working on the repeatability of these high outputs, and along with the aerobic system. And then we touch a little bit of lactic so they could feel it.
What did you find out was key to the repeatability of it?
The literature is very clear. Repeat sprintability comes down to two things: maximal output and aerobic capacity.
Okay. So you've got to train both those things, and you train those a little bit. Well, I mean, you're training them simultaneously in some sense, but you're also training them differently, right? So,
very.
Yeah. So
on different days.
Yeah, on different days, right? So with your aerobic capacity training, you're doing tempo runs, which is basically like a slower run, so to speak. And then with your maximal training, you're doing these high intensity intervals, if you will, jumping, lifting.
5 to 10 second efforts at the max with complete rest, minutes of recovery. Tempos would be like, and we could do them positionally because it's not just the heart. You're also training the tissues, right? You're trying to create adaptations in the tissues.
That's right.
So, linemen may do extensive wall rebounds for 30 or 45 seconds to create more capillary density in the arms, while the heart is also changing. But we would keep the heart rate, in this like kind of 120 to 150 range, 140 range, and to try to, improve aerobic capacity. And it paid off. I mean, they were.
And did you find that when you trained people this way, that you were decreasing injury? Was this part of your injury decrease, or was there something else?
Yeah, these are the best questions I've ever been asked on this, by the way. You're really, really intuitive and smart. Yes, and it for multiple reasons. One, if you're less fatigued, you're better able to coordinate motor activity. Right. So when in a situation in a game, when you're not, neuromuscular coordination is better. So if you're less fatigued, your body's able to respond better.
Yep.
Then it was also the practice. So we prepared them better, and then we practiced them in a way that didn't microwave the process. And then this is all to credit to the head coach, because he's the one that had to say yes and then do it. And then in practice, we'd be like, all right, in the morning, we would look over, we had systems of sports science stuff that we would put together. Like, hey, so-and-so we think's getting pretty tired. He's a key player. Coach would be like, all right, Eric, I want you to monitor him. And once he gets to X number of reps, we're pulling him out. So I literally wore a headset in practice. And I'd walk over to the coach. And I'd be like, it was like sophisticated. To this day, I think it was probably one of the most sophisticated systems, and we had a lot of things going for us. We had elite talent, great coaches.
Sure. I got to believe that sleep was a big part of this. Like what I notice in my own world, and I do something every day, right? I wake up 27 every day. Today I ran, 3 miles or whatever. But I noticed that my sleep and recovery scores make a big impact on my ability to perform on a given day. And so I'm sure you must have been tracking sleep in part of all this too, and factoring that into what you were expecting from them, or no?
This is 2011.
Okay, you weren't tracking sleep.
One of my mentors, Dr. Gershon Tenenbaum, he's one of the world's leading sports psychologists, over 300 peer-reviewed journal articles. He says everything is complex, multidimensional, and relative. So if you think about a multidimensional system, if you just think of the biggest things that are hindering your way and you get those rocks out of the way, if you keep all other things the same, you're going to get better. This was Florida State now. Like, these guys were in college, and I did do sleep stuff later we could talk about with college athletes, and we can talk about how that impacted them. But this was just like the fundamentals.
Okay.
Of training.
Interesting. And did you notice that with this training that people would actually not only perform better, but their performance levels would also rise over what they had been previously, like with this repetition and things and training in this manner, that they actually became the best version of themselves, that they played better than they ever had, kind of thing? Did you notice that also?
Yeah, it's kind of hard in a team setting. The whole team got better.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of things that go into that. We had elite talent that was getting better. They were getting better at their skill.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we were less fatigued. That part of the game wasn't a limiting factor anymore. So they could express their skill better.
Let me ask you this. So you're measuring all these metrics, motion, heart rate. We talked a little bit about heart rate as an internal metric. There are other ones that I don't know that we fully articulated. But the question I have is, you were doing all that in practice. Were you also doing it in the games where you were making real-time game strategy decisions based on who's tired, who's not, who's ready to go, that kind of stuff? Or was on game day we're just taking everything off, we're just going to go play?
Listen, man, I worked in the National Football League. When it comes time to play, it doesn't friggin' matter. Like, you're a grown man, you're getting paid to play. You know, in college now, you're getting paid to play with the NIL. But like, the goal was get them to game day in the best possible situation,
and then let them go.
And then let them go. And we can probably talk about adaptive capacity here if you want to. That's kind of where the research took me after looking at all the external stuff.
Yeah.
But you know, yeah, when it's game day, it's freaking game day. You go.
Okay. So you weren't monitoring people on game day. You were just
No, we would monitor we're not pulling them out of a game. We would monitor, we would just track the game to see what the output was like, but that can be misleading because I tracked a game once, an SEC football game. Our players ran faster than any team I'd ever seen before.
Wow.
And we had gotten shellacked by 40 points. Okay. The reason they were able to run so fast, in football, there's rarely ever breakout plays. Mm-hmm. The faster you collapse space, so it's all about acceleration. Well, in this game, we were chasing people a lot.
Got it.
So we had like 8 or 9 players run over 20 miles an hour. And that was like a light bulb moment for me. Like, speed doesn't always equal performance.
Right.
The NFL – sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, especially if you're on defense chasing some guy that's running 21 miles an hour, right? So –
yeah, you'd rather have only gotten up to maybe 10, but you close that space so fast that's as fast as you had to run.
Right. Got it. So let's talk about the adaptive elements here, because this is an interesting concept. This kind of, what's the term that you use? Adaptive capacity. Yeah. So let's talk about adaptive capacity. Tell us what you mean by that. What is adaptive capacity? The ability to adapt, the magnitude of adaptation, the range of adapt. Tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah. So let me tell you how I got to this. So I'm working with Olympic sprinters, college football players. So we talk about external training load, now internal training load, heart rate during game, but then like what indicates how they're adapting? You can look at heart rate variability. We also were looking at something called direct current potential of the brain, or DC potential. It's a slow cortical potential that represents how the central nervous system is adapting to stress. So you got the autonomic and central components. Mm-hmm. And we started noticing that like the best in the world, not average, but the elite, had the same signature across all sports. They could adapt to tremendous amounts of physical and psychological stress, and it looked like nothing happened. So we could just pummel them, and the next day they would just be normal. You're like, what in the world? Meanwhile, their teammate is like going on this downward spiral. Mm-hmm. So what happens is their ability to adapt to stress is bigger. Their adaptive reserves, or their tank, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. So we're like, okay, how do we build this capacity into anybody?
This is fascinating that you bring this up. I tell you, you were talking about when you're training, that you're training sort of the metabolic system, right? The different energy metabolic systems. And I've always had this working thought about training that, people think we're training the muscles or we're training this and that. For me, it's really about training the nervous system.
You're exactly right. The muscles are nothing but a dumb piece of meat.
Exactly. So you're really training the nervous system, and you're training
both.
Well, you are training both, but You are training both, but this is not an exclusion. Many things can be true at once.
Yeah. This is it's like I said, it's multidimensional, right?
Exactly. But when you're training the nervous system, you're doing it from a couple of different perspectives. You're training it for coordinated movement. You're training it for reaction time. You're training it for, sudden outputs and all that stuff. But then you're also training it from the standpoint of maintaining the mind kind of in this more Zen space, right? Where you're actually go into a flow state and you can actually see everything in slow motion, right? This whole concept, right? So anyway, I'm just curious. I'll just tee that up for you because I think you probably want to hit that tee.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just want to go back to physical training, first of all. Like the way, like speed and power is essentially driven output. It is the central nervous system, which is what drives that. Mm-hmm. And so you train that very differently than you would just aerobic capacity. Aerobic capacity is less driven by the central nervous system. You can gauge adaptation more with the autonomic nervous system with that.
Okay.
Speed, power is all driven by the CNS. Okay. So there is like the physical training, which you're talking about. In high performance, there's physical, psychological, technical, tactical, and intellectual. The psychological component is what you're talking about here, is like the ability to be present and aware, to regulate your emotions so that you can direct your actions in a deliberate way. When fear and stress is not bad, it can actually harness your attention. It can actually provide you the resources you need to do the hard thing. Yeah. But if you haven't harnessed that, it can lead to just total chaos, or poor performance.
Right.
So that's a whole nother realm of training, but all of it leads to adaptive capacity. So what we found is like there are 5 pillars to make somebody more adaptable to stress.
Okay.
With less cost. So sleep, exercise, mental fitness, nutrition, and fostering healthy relationships. The scientific literature is very clear that all 5 of these things not only improve longevity, but they improve your ability to adapt to psychophysiological stress. Some of them have crossover adaptations, but they impact different parts of the physiology, but it enables you to build a bigger tank.
This episode of the Gladden Longevity Podcast is brought to you by H2 Molecular Hydrogen in the Gladden Longevity store.
Yeah, Steve, you've heard us talk about this numerous times on the podcast in terms of the benefits of H2 and hydrogen water. We love it. It's really the best way to balance your entire redox system. So it really protects you from free radical damage. I take it every time I get on a flight to protect me from radiation damage when I'm flying. And I use it to rejuvenate my brain in the afternoon. There's really 2 kinds of exercise. There's physical exercise, and taking H2 before or after that works great. But also there's mental exercise. And I find that the H2 will bring your brain back when you're tired in the afternoon. So I think it's like the perfect thing for longevity and for performance, quite honestly.
And I talked to you about this, that I found dropping 1 or 2 tablets in a glass of water right before bed. I've seen an overall bump in my deep sleep when I do so.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you click on the store tab when you visit GladdenLongevityShop.com and use the promo code podcast10, you'll get 10% off your order. And this code isn't only good for our H2 product, but it's also good for all the supplements we carry. So podcast10 at the GladdenLongevityShop.com.
Yeah, one of the other things that I use it for routinely is when I'm about to go on a mountain bike ride. And I will say this, that if I go on a long mountain bike ride, I will take one prior, I'll take one during, and I'll take one after. And some of the Ironmen that we've worked with have said that when they're doing an Ironman, they'll take it 3 or 4 times throughout the race. And their comment is that it's like taking out the old battery and putting in a new one. It really rejuvenates your body's ability to perform when you're doing more extended athletic activity. So think about that too. If you want to go do a longer hike or whatever else, take it with you.
So GladdenLongevityShop.com, enter podcast 10 for 10% off your order.
H2 molecular hydrogen. It's low-hanging fruit on your quest to make 100 the new 30. Let's just walk through those 5 and kind of unpack each one a little bit, because I think they're all excellent and they resonate with me, but I just would like to unpack them with you a little bit more. So let's start wherever you want to start.
Yeah, I mean, sleep was the passion project for my doctoral work.
Okay.
I wanted to understand, its impact on how we adapt to stress. I could give you just a couple things that it impacts significantly. The immune system. So when we have these, we go into stress state without boring the audience. We have the HPA axis gets turned on, the sympathetic nervous system, and you have an immune response, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you go to sleep, these stress systems are down-regulated, turned off, or turned down, right? The volume's turned down. What does that do? Now it allows our immune system to ramp up. And actually during sleep, you create immunological memory, specifically during slow wave sleep, where you're now kind of it creates this situation. There's a great paper in the European Journal of Physiology, which kind of demonstrates how you create this immunological memory. So you remember foreign invaders and your body's more able to, attack those foreign invaders. Cortisol is down-regulated. So from an endocrine perspective, as males, most of our testosterone is released during REM sleep, which is really significant because if you go to bed and cut your sleep duration off, you're lowering your testosterone significantly. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, our testosterone declines 1% to 2% per year after the age of 30. We can slow that down, but just sleep depriving yourself to 5 hours a night for 1 week ages you over a decade in the terms of testosterone. And so a lot of guys are going to TRT and they really just need to get their sleep back online.
Mm-hmm.
Impacts growth hormone secretion, which is really critical for tissue regeneration, neurodegeneration from the glymphatic system. So our brain has this detoxification system called the glymphatic system. You have the cerebrospinal fluid that goes up into your brain, and during sleep, it flushes this out along with metabolic waste products that are associated with neurodegeneration, emotional regulation, cognitive function. So all these amazing things. The funny thing about sleep is so many great things are happening. If you ever read sleep research, it always starts off with sleep is, a fundamental biological process that is yet to be fully elucidated. So it's one of these things. It's like we're learning all these things that are happening. So, and then there's memory and learning that happens, memory consolidation and learning. So the neuroplastic changes are really finalized during sleep. And so it is absolutely critical. And I would say for those people out there that are interested in sleep, there's really only 3 things that you really need to focus on. And you do not need to focus on sleep stages you get from your Oura ring, because it is not accurate. The research demonstrates that Oura is like 79% accurate for deep and REM sleep. They're trying to proxy something that you get from polysomnography and eye movement with actigraphy and HRV. I think we may get there one day, but
no, it's far from perfect.
So don't index on it. It's actually, in my opinion, respectfully to these companies, it's inappropriate for them to report on it like they do. We know that onset, duration, and consistency you can accurately measure with a consistent degree of error. But so the 3 things you need to look at is how long am I sleeping? 7 to 9 hours is critical. Research demonstrates that there's like a U-shaped relationship, below or above, increased risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and actually there was a twin study done with over 20,000 twin pairs. And they found that the twin that slept less than 7 hours, this was over 20 years, had a 24% increase in all-cause mortality. So if you want to look at how a behavior impacts, outcomes, look at twin studies.
Yeah.
So you have duration, you have when you go to bed. So going to bed at 1 and waking up at 8 or 9 is not the same thing as going to bed at 10 and waking up at 6. There was a great paper done by MIT and Harvard with 800,000 people in the UK Biobank, and they showed that people that go to bed earlier and wake up earlier, as a matter of fact, if you shift your sleep midpoint of sleep back 1 hour, they had a 23% reduction in major depression.
Yeah. It's interesting. 1 hour earlier is worth, 2 hours on the back end is kind of what we tend to think, right? So if you went to bed at, let's say, 10 and you slept until 8 the next morning, right? If you went to bed at 9 and got up at, 5 in the morning, you would actually end up better off, right? So it's interesting. Yeah.
100%. I mean, and you know what this is all tied to? This paper, you gotta read this paper. It was beautifully designed. It was done with 23andMe data, UK Biobank data, Wearable. It was crazy. They found, first of all, they wanted to look at chronotypes. Mm-hmm. And I think it was only 9% of people are genetically an evening type.
Okay, that's interesting. So chronotypes, just for the audience to understand that, we've talked about this term previously, but it has to do with kind of, are you a morning person, or are you a nighttime person, or are you a night owl, that kind of thing. So
it's fascinating because a lot of people say they're evening types and they're really not. It's their behaviors associated with their with their smartphones and light and everything. But here's the crazy thing. So I'm reading this paper and I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, I think I know why. I think I know why it is that people go to bed earlier, have less risk of depression. And I'm reading and it's like, boom. It was like the only linkage they could find to why this would be people that go to bed earlier and wake up earlier have more exposure to what?
Sunlight.
Boom. You got it, Steve.
Yeah.
And because it when you see morning sunlight and more frequent exposure to sunlight, it kicks off a cascade of hormonal and neurological events that directly impact your mood.
Mm-hmm.
And so your duration, when you go to bed, and the consistency of your sleep routine, because you can get social jet lag. So that would be sleep. The next one.
Social jet lag, that's a new term we haven't used before. So are you talking about in a social context, people stay up later and then they kind of get a jet lag sort of?
So if you have a sleep routine, let's say during the week, and a different one on the weekends, you can get what's something called social jet lag, which leads to increased risk of cardiometabolic disease, weight gain, depression. Okay. So be a human. It can flex a little bit, but like anything over an hour deviation, that's why people like, man, Mondays suck. I hate life. It's because you went to bed, Sunday through, let's call it Sunday through Thursday, and then Friday, Saturday, you stayed up till whenever and slept in. Your body's circadian rhythm is totally jacked up.
Yep.
So Kathy Goldstein at the University of Michigan, she'd be great for your show. She came on my show and we talked about all this. And it's really simple, fundamental stuff. If you have a wearable, and I love wearables, I have a company based off of this, just focus on those three things: how long you sleep, when you go to bed, and how consistent your sleep is. The next big one I would mention would be mental fitness, which is I define as the ability to be consciously present, to process information without bias, so that it empowers you to respond quickly and rationally to changing circumstances through committed actions anchored in your values. Think about it like this. Just because you experience uncomfortable thoughts, emotions, and feelings doesn't mean you have to perform or act in a way that's different than who you are.
Yep.
And when there's a disconnect between how you're acting and who you really are, it creates a lot of angst. It can create frustration. And I experience this in sports. There's a myth out there that the best in the world don't feel pressure. That's complete bullcrap.
That's not true at all. Yeah.
But people believe that. They're like, there's a guy named Sir Chris Hoy. He's the greatest Olympic cyclist of all time. Okay. From the UK. I think it was, how many gold? I think it was 5 or 8 gold medals in cycling. Got to look this up. This guy was amazing. But he said, somebody asked him, what was it like to race in Olympic finals? And he said, it felt like I was going to the gallows.
Interesting.
But what he would then say is so they're like, well, what did you do? He's like, so I would shift my attention to my grip on the steering wheel, my butt in the seat, my feet in the clips, So he was doing what? He was mindful.
Mm-hmm.
And my friend Dr. Peter Haberl says attention is the currency of performance.
Nice. I like this.
So
Yeah,
if you can train that through what?
Through practice, right?
Train through mindfulness.
Yeah.
Mindfulness is training your awareness.
Yeah. Which actually starts to dovetail for me with flow states, because for me, a flow state is actually being meditation in motion. It's kind of how I think of it almost, right? So.
Yeah. It also prevents task switching, rumination, anxiety. And if you want to be in a flow state, what do you have to do? You have to be focused on one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that is like probably one of the most fulfilling work experiences that you can have.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Next would be exercise without going into. Go ahead. Sorry.
Is there a place for that on a football team? Flow state? I'm sure there must be.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in any craft. The game slows down. You don't hear the noise. You just can make decisions without thinking.
Yeah. The reason I ask that is because for me, a flow state, if I'm mountain biking or snowboarding or surfing or something like that, it's it's more of a continual, especially mountain biking or snowboarding, it's more of a continual state that you're in. With football, it's kind of interrupted, right? The referee blows the whistle, you're back in the huddle, you're doing this. So to maintain that flow state in the context of all those sort of shifts, if you will, kind of in being in motion, not being in motion, is, to me, would seem to be a little bit more challenging potentially, but I'm sure you could train yourself to maintain it, I suppose.
Yeah, it's still within a confine of an experience that you're used to.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a different, it's like waves in the ocean, right?
It is, yeah.
It's just more intermittent, but like great quarterbacks, great athletes, there's so much cognitive processing that's going on, depending on the position especially.
Mm-hmm.
But you've trained it so much and you're in a state where it's just happening.
That's right.
And that's really, really hard to get to. But I think that flow states exist in all different types of activities.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, so you've got sleep, and let's see, what are the other pillars that we're going through?
We got
here?
exercise. I without going too detailed and down that rabbit hole, I would just say this: like, there's something called a cross-stressor adaptation with exercise, where being physically fit and having a healthy body improves resilience by blunting different stress responses, and it develops physical and psychological resilience. It can protect you from illness, but it's a general resilience. It's not very specific. So I hate this term, like, there's certain people out there that are like, you should be mentally tough, to everything. That's impossible. You can be inoculated to specific stressors over time, but you can have general resilience and optimism. And we could talk about how that plays out, but I've worked in the special operations community, and you could take a trained Army Ranger that's never gone through jump school. Tough dude, right? Mm-hmm. Put him up in a plane, throw a parachute on him, and hold him at the edge of the door and say, jump. He's going to freak out. He's going to have a stress response. So let's say I take a gold medalist sharpshooter, and I put him with a Michelin-starred chef and say, cook.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to stress. Yeah. It's okay. But if you inoculate yourself to that stress, if you train it, become more, then you can control it.
Mm-hmm.
But exercise has a general buffer for physiological and psychological stress. And there's like a threshold that everybody should be hitting, 150 to 300 minutes of what's called moderate to vigorous physical activity a week, 2 total body strengthening sessions. If you do that, the literature shows you have about a 47% reduction in all-cause mortality. Yep. I mean, that's significant. So there's a lot of camps on exercise that I think is a little bit ridiculous, because having been in that world for so long, there's not one perfect way of doing things, but we know that there's general principles. you need to get your heart rate up consistently and you need to strengthen your body.
Yeah.
For the general population, how you do that, as long as the weightlifting is and the resistance training is intense enough to stimulate a mechanical adaptation to the tissue, machines, dumbbells, kettlebells, at some times resistance bands.
Yeah.
There's even literature showing that body weight alone, as long as the volume is high enough, and you basically have to bring yourself to near volitional fatigue, still can stimulate hypertrophy.
Totally.
So I don't want to alienate anybody on that because you prefer CrossFit versus somebody else that likes, but it just has to be intense enough to stimulate a mechanical adaptation.
Yeah, and I'll say this: I think most people don't exercise hard enough.
No.
They just don't. I mean, they think that if it's starting to hurt or be uncomfortable, that they're doing too much. When in actual fact, if you can carry on a conversation while you're doing your cardio, I don't think you're really doing cardio per se. And if if you're not feeling it when you're doing your resistance training, you're not really doing resistance training. So,
I mean, a zone 2 workout would be like 75% of max, 60 to 75% of max heart rate. Most people could probably talk.
They can answer a question, but they may not be able to carry on a conversation. Well, zone 2, they might be able to. But if all you do is zone 2, I still don't think you're getting enough cardio, quite honestly.
You'd have to get more volume.
Yeah.
But you still get eccentric cardiac hypertrophy. You would still get all the peripheral vascularization, I think that's the point. Like the literature is like, you can shorten it. You can go, you can hit near max heart rate if you want to kind of get there faster. But in my opinion, and from what I've seen in the literature, there's no differentiation for people that are doing. The literature does show people that double those parameters do live longer.
Yeah. So
if you go 600 minutes a week, there is an extension of life. But
yeah, I'm just basing it on the fact that we measure VO2 max in everybody, and we see that the people that get the best bumps in their VO2 are the people that push harder. They'll do zone 2, but then they'll also do interval training on top of that, right?
100%.
Right. Yeah. So.
Oh yeah, like if you want to push your VO2 max, you're going to need to get near maximal heart rate.
That's right.
But if the average person on the planet, especially Americans, I think we would all agree if we can just get them moving, I think we would all be pretty happy.
That's right. Getting off the sofa is massively important, quite honestly.
Yes, sir. Yeah,
for sure.
Last 2, nutrition. Again, I don't want to alienate anybody on this one, but there's some pretty standard fundamentals. Don't want to eat an inflammatory diet.
Yeah.
We don't want to eat tons of processed foods. I think the Mediterranean-ish diet is the most researched diet. There's pretty standard commonalities in there. Multicolored fruits and vegetables, seeds and nuts, plenty of fat, fatty fish, but like, I don't want to I'm not going to come on here and be like, carnivores, you're all evil people, or my vegan friends are bad folks. But, there's some some things we could all agree on that the literature is pretty clear. Ultra processed foods and inflammatory foods are wrecking your health.
That's right. Yeah. And they really undo the good that you do with other good foods, right? So I've kind of taken a nutrient dense approach to eating, right? Where the more nutrient dense foods you can get in, the healthier I feel, the better I feel. It's when you start eating kind of calorie rich, nutrient poor foods that you start to get into the feeling bloated, feeling whatever, feeling sluggish. And so, so I tend to, I'm not a vegetarian. I'm not a pescatarian. I'm not, anything really, but I'm really all about nutrient density. And then I think variety, your immune system and your gut like variety, quite honestly, from what we've seen. So variety and stressing nutrient density seems to be where I hit my own sweet spot, and a lot of our clients do. So
I'm with you. Yeah. I probably follow a very similar approach for my personal health. And then I'd say the last one is community.
Yeah.
We are starting to see a lot of amazing literature coming out about healthy relationships and impact on our health because of COVID.
Yeah.
People were able to study the impacts of isolation. And I found a couple papers before I came on here. One from the British Psychological Society that found that during the pandemic, people with greater social connectedness, whether it was they were talking to people more often, they found a way to connect more often. They had less worry and fatigue, lower perceived levels of stress. There was a whole host of benefits, but they basically found that it created a buffer against poor mental and physical health outcomes.
Yep.
There was one that just came out of the University of Kansas that I thought was just amazing. And they found that one meaningful conversation per day improved mood, lowered stress, and enhanced social connectedness significantly. And that electronic forms were significantly less effective.
Totally. Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. It's the dopamine hit versus the oxytocin of connection, right? These are the two trade-offs, I think. There's been some nice studies showing that isolation, the effects of isolation can be overcome by oxytocin. And, when connectedness, we release oxytocin, which, in sexual activity, hugging, kissing, deep closeness or whatever. So it's really, I think it's an important thing to go for the real thing, right? Connectedness, emotionally, intellectually, physically. It's all super, super important. And I just saw a really startling piece of data, which is that in young men, they're becoming more and more isolated to where 1 in 7 young men, I think in their 20s, doesn't have a single friend.
Really?
1 in 7. Yeah, doesn't have a single friend. I just read it's all on social media for them and this kind of stuff, but they don't really have, they haven't really developed, real friendships, right? And it's like, oh my gosh, what a sad thing.
That's awful.
Right?
And I had a guy on my podcast recently. He's a high school coach, online strength coach. He's very connected to the youth of today. He's up in the Northeast, and he said he watches these kids. The kids go to prom by themselves now,
right?
Because they don't know how to. Like they just don't. They don't ask a date. They don't have the courage. They haven't talked to to people enough to actually just go and ask for a date. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, this is the late 90s, but I'm like, man, nobody went alone. Like you if you didn't have a date or a girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever it was, you just asked your friend to go with you. Like, all right, we've been friends for 5 years. You want to go prom? I don't want to go by myself. Now he's like, everybody just goes by themselves. I'm like, that is so bizarre.
Yeah. No, it's really, this isolation is real. And I think COVID was a massive piece, but there's another element of isolation, which I think to your point comes out of the electronics. I think it's very isolating. So.
No doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the 5 pillars. And there's a lot of nuance but when you can engage in these consistently over time and you find the area that you're struggling in and then you can build it out, your capacity for global physical and psychological stress improves. Mm-hmm. Your ability to adapt to exercise gets better. So people see significantly better results with their fitness, their ability to learn, process information, and just not just cope with stress, but thrive under it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me too, there's an element of not being committed to an outcome that creates adaptability. Because when you're committed to an outcome, then all of a sudden you have something to be disappointed about if it doesn't happen. But if you have a general direction, right, but you realize there's going to be many twists and turns, and you're not committed to the exact outcome, it just enables you to enjoy it along the way. It's like, oh, here's a new opportunity. I didn't know this was going to unfold, but everything's now an opportunity instead of everything is a stressor, right? Because it's not in the way of where I want to go. It's actually another door that leads to something bigger. So being able to reframe life as a series of opportunities instead of a series of hurdles or stressors, I think for me anyway, has been massively helpful. So,
that's beautiful. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good stuff. Cool. Well, Erik, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you. Really enjoy all your insights. Steve, you have a question?
Erik, talk about AIM 7. Oh. What is AIM 7? What are you guys doing? You got a brand new app in the App Store that Dr. Gladden and I just downloaded because it dropped today.
Thank you. 3 years of work, 3 years, $1.5 million invested in this thing. I love sports because I wanted to take all the things that we had built there and make them accessible to anybody with a wearable, right? So we talked about wearables, but long story short, it's just data. It doesn't tell you how to look, feel, and perform better, and that's what we're doing. So we built the app that helps you thrive under stress, stop burnout, and we provide you with daily personalized recommendations for your mind, body, and recovery. So your exercise, your sleep, and your mental fitness to help you thrive. And these aren't just like insights. This is like the precise type, intensity, and duration of exercise that you can adapt to. Some of the IP that we built about 10 years ago has been baked into this app. From a mental fitness perspective, we can provide you with a precise breathwork tool or gratitude intervention based off of your current psychological state. And then we do all the stuff we talked about, sleep. It's in the app. And then after about 7 days, we analyze your data and we're like, here's the area you should, that would make the biggest improvement for you in your health and fitness. And then we create a little goal and then we kind of walk you step by step towards that result.
Cool. And how do you get the data into the app? How does that work?
So we have part of our secret sauce is we combine wearable data. So your Apple Watch, your Oura Ring, your Fitbit, your Garmin, and we combine it with how you feel.
Okay.
So there's we could do a whole podcast on this, but the problem, like if you got an Oura Ring on, like great data. I have an Oura Ring, right? Except for the sleep stages we talked about, but some days it's like, Eric, you're at 90%. I'm like, I feel like garbage. Yeah, Steve's pointing at the screen. He knows what I'm talking about. Yeah. There's a reason for that. Wearable data is a lagging indicator of how your body's adapting to stress. How you feel is directly related to what is happening now. And so it's proxying off of things that it happened in the past. And so we've been working on this stuff for over a decade. And so we've had over 500 people use our private beta app. We had paying customers in the first 30 days. Like the average person that was using our app had a 19% improvement in motivation. They had 16% better sleep, 17% better mood, 15% less stress, and 13% more energy. We benchmark all of this stuff. So people get significant results. And then over time, they're building the capacity for more stress at less cost. And so I appreciate you asking me. It's been I guess you could say my life's work up to this point, and we're coming out with some really fascinating stuff in the next couple of months. So if you don't mind putting a link in there, we'll give your audience I think I've already given you a code that they can use for 25% off their first month of AIM7.
Yeah, I think it's actually the discount code is Gladden, and it's $1 for the first month.
Oh, that's right. Even better. Yeah, try AIM7 for $1. I think you're the only person I gave that to, by the way.
All right.
So I appreciate you sharing. Yeah, so try AIM7. It's a free 7-day trial, and then you pay $1. I don't think you're going to get a better deal anywhere on the planet.
Right.
And then, it's really awesome. We have a masterclass community, a library in there of over 100 pieces of content from world-leading experts in nutrition, sleep science. We have the former senior psychologist for the U.S. Olympics. And then every 2 weeks, we host these virtual seminars from some of the biggest experts in the world are going to come. You can ask questions. Cool. We do a seminar. So we're trying to create kind of like a little bit of a movement here.
Yeah.
Where we're empowering and equipping people with the knowledge and information they need to thrive.
Nice. So do you integrate with Whoop also, or?
We used to, we hopefully will again.
Okay. They can be cantankerous, quite honestly, to work with sometimes.
You said it, I didn't. It's an API that gets shut off and then turned back on. And so it is what it is.
Yep. Cool. Good. All right. Well, there it is. Good. So thanks again for all that.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure.
Yeah. Super fun. Yeah. And if you'd like me on your podcast, just let me know.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
I'll have Andrea reach out. We'll get you on the show.
Yeah. That'd be great.
And Eric, In order to use that promo code, people should go to the website aim7.com, correct?
Yes, go to aim7.com so you can use the code. Don't try it on the App Store. Apple's a little finicky about this stuff. So go right to the site. You'll sign up. It'll be really smooth.